Happy February, everyone. I'm Susan Wingrove-Reed, the education consultant for the Anchorage Symphony Orchestra, and we're so excited about the upcoming concert where we're going to engage with old friends and make new friends in the musical world. Let's start off with a few thoughts about the Mendelssohn Overture that begins the concert. Mendelssohn wrote 7 freestanding overtures that were based on non-musical ideas, so they weren't linked to like an opera per se. For example, Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage is one of those overtures. These were forerunners of the symphonic poem form pioneered by Franz Liszt 10 to 12 years later. The legend of the half-mermaid Melusina appears to date back over nearly 12 centuries. In fact, the first printed version of this tale was found to exist in 1387. The arrestingly beautiful Melusina, born of a mortal father and a water sprite mother, is cursed to take the form of a serpent from her waist down, what we would call a mermaid, one day each week. This curse was laid on her by her mother, furious with Melusina for entombing her father in a mountain for the mistreatment of her mother. Some years later, Melusina is proposed to by a man of nobility. As did her mother years before, she agrees to marriage, but with the one condition that she maintain absolute privacy on her one day a week, her serpent day of secrecy. Great happiness takes over the two lovers until the inevitable day when his curiosity eventually ends their bliss. He had never asked her what she did on Saturdays, but then that was violated. On being discovered, she is doomed to remain in her mermaid form for eternity. Goethe set the famous legend as part of a novel in 1807. The opening theme of Mendelssohn's overture, with its delightfully cascading arpeggiated motifs, certainly represents the gracefulness of Melusina, the beautiful mermaid in water. Viennese writer Franz Grillparzer wrote an opera libretto about Melusina and offered it to Beethoven, who said, no, thank you. Konstantin Kreutzer composed an opera, which was not a success, but Mendelssohn attended a performance and was inspired by the failure he felt of the music with this subject. And so he was inspired to write his own. By the way, Grillparzer became the most famous Austrian writer of the 19th century. And Kreutzer, who was not the violinist that Beethoven dedicated the Kreutzer Sonata to, was forgotten to history. Mendelssohn's overture was first performed in 1834 by the London Philharmonic Society. It was called The Mermaid and the Knight, but there wasn't a very enthusiastic audience reception, so he revised it in 1836. And a reviewer at that concert said, the overture, it does not try to translate the whole tale into music, but only to conjure up for us from the dream world of harmonic power, the happiness and unhappiness of two beings. Melusina is not among Mendelssohn's better-known works, but the composer was very fond of it. He made a point of saying that his overture didn't represent a telling of the story, but rather a reflection of its themes and moods. It's easy to hear Melusina and her watery home in the beginning, and the conflicts in the curse and her terrestrial marriage in the second part of it. Indeed, the motif that begins the overture is so quintessentially aquatic that it became something of a cliche. Wagner souped it up and used it to represent the Rhine River, home to his own water maidens in the Ring Cycle. Wagner rarely missed a chance to say something disparaging or bigoted about Mendelssohn, but conceded in typically condescending fashion that Mendelssohn was a first-class landscape painter. And in fact, Mendelssohn studied landscape painting at the time that he wrote this overture. Wagner was more right than he knew. Mendelssohn's Melusina is a complex emotional landscape of psyches in conflict and pain intruding on idyllic love. French composer Louis Ferenc was born in 1804, the year that Napoleon was self-proclaimed emperor. Her dad was a court sculptor. He now has two pieces in the Louvre. And her sister and brother were also sculptors and painters. They lived in an artist colony of 30 families in service to the court and were very open to exploring the talents of women involved in the colony. She began to study the piano when she was 6 years old, and at 15 was accepted to the Paris Conservatory, the only female in her class. She became a concert pianist, quite famous when she was in her 30s, during a lot of touring. In 1842, when she was 38, she was the only woman appointed to be professor at the Paris Conservatory and became one of the greatest piano professors in Europe. And she composed. Joseph Joachim was keen to play her music and her music was praised by Berlioz and Schumann. She was tenacious and outspoken about equal rights and equal pay for women. She got her own pay raise, but only after lobbying for 7 years at the conservatory. But she wasn't allowed to teach composition, as it was exclusively male, until 5 years before her death. By all accounts, she was a formidable personality. When she was 17, she had married Aristide Ferenc, a flute student who was 10 years older than she was, and they gave concerts together. In 1826, she took a break from her jobs to have a daughter, Victorine, who also became a concert pianist and composer. But sadly, she died at the age of 33 after a lengthy battle with tuberculosis. Louise was so grief-stricken that she stopped writing her own music for at least the last 16 years of her life and became an advocate for her daughter's works. Her husband, the flute player, decided that he was really more something of a hack and it wasn't going to be his vocation. So with Louise's assistance, he founded a publishing house, which became one of France's leading music publishers. And we owe him a debt of gratitude for editing and publishing the works of his wife. There was an interesting quote about the couple's relationship that I found. Aristide Ferenc was able to sense his young wife's talent for composing, to encourage her, virtually force her, they say, to make available to the public works which her modesty, of a degree rarely encountered, impelled her to keep unpublished. Louise studied the piano under a few famous teachers, and that included Hummel, one of the big names of the era. And she studied composition with Anton Reicha, the teacher of Berlioz, Liszt, and Franck. In 1842, she began a 30-year career as that professor of piano at the conservatory. And she was the only female professor at the conservatory in the entire 19th century. Ferenc's compositions were performed during her lifetime and received enthusiastically, but became neglected after her death until quite recently. Her third symphony, which we will play, was composed in 1847 and premiered in 1849, and it stands as evidence of the unjustness of the neglect of her repertoire. In the soundness of its form, the beauty and novelty of its orchestration, as well as its delightful counterpoint, Ferenc's symphony stands the test of time alongside those that directly preceded it from Mendelssohn, Schubert, and Schumann. Ferenc's symphony, according to Tom Service, who's a music critic for The Guardian, is as impressively energetic and structurally satisfying as any of Mendelssohn's or Schumann's symphonies. So does that make it male or female? Who cares? Enjoy getting to know this shamefully neglected work. She became one of the most successful and sought-after piano teachers of her time. There were systemic problems in French musical life regarding her composing career that made it pretty well impossible for symphonic music to flourish in France at this time. In the absence of orchestras for hire, composers had to either put together pickup bands at their own expense or otherwise hope that their work was picked by performances, for example, by conservatories, which happened in the case of this symphony, where it was first played in 1849. Ferenc is asking to be taken seriously as a symphonist in a genre in which there were no significant precedents for a woman competing on her own terms with any of the great men of the past or present. But now let's just get back to the Third Symphony. The first movement moves seamlessly and impressively from a short, slow introduction into a feverish allegro that ends with a wild coda, unleashing the movement's intensity. The slow movement has a clarinet melody that is magnificently cosseted by low brass and woodwinds. And the scherzo, according to one program annotator that I enjoyed, said the scherzo out Mendelssohn's Mendelssohn himself with its flighty, haunted gossamer of trills and pianissimo figures. But I have to say, my favorite movement is the finale, which, after an implacable unison, there's one of the most memorable tunes anyone ever wrote in a final movement of a symphony. She makes use of contrapuntal writing that burns with diabolical ferocity before a dark, uncompromisingly minor key coda. There are references here, above all, to Mozart's G minor symphony number 40, as well as Schumann and even Chopin in the flexibility of her tunes. But the result is something distinctively her own voice, uniquely expressive and significant, that needs to be recognized and heard. I know you will fall in love with Ferenc's Third Symphony. The symphony was premiered at the Paris Conservatory in a program that included Beethoven's Fifth. It could have been overshadowed by that piece, but sometime after the symphony's premiere, a critic wrote, "There is no musician who does not remember Mademoiselle Ferenc's symphony performed at the conservatory, a strong and spirited work in which the brilliance of the melodies contends with the varieties of the harmonies." And recently, The Guardian included Ferenc's Third Symphony in the list of the 50 greatest symphonies of all time. If Beethoven's Ninth Symphony unites people with the idea of brotherhood, his Seventh Symphony unites people with the idea of dance. We dance, we connect, we share a space. The feeling is of going to a rock concert together, being close to each other, sharing energy. A cramped city apartment is strewn with clothes, plates of rotting food where Beethoven lived. At a table, a short, stocky man hunches over a mess of papers. Joy did not come easily to Ludwig van Beethoven. He lived the life of a successful freelance composer, his name on people's lips, his living heavily subsidized. But he was worried by chronic illness, encroaching deafness, and loneliness. His diaries are full of pain and frustration. What life failed, art rescued. Calling himself a tone poet, Beethoven believed that music is more than beauty. It has moral and religious dimension. Only art and science, he wrote, can raise people to the level of the gods. Fascinated by a new invention, the metronome, which all of us younger musicians are doomed to use as we practice our scales and etudes these days, Beethoven could dictate exactly how fast his music should be played now. The speed of his metronome markings pushes difficult music to the edge of unplayability. Fingers are stretched and tongues are tied in the wind section. The Seventh Symphony is boisterous, intense, energetic, and tuneful. Opus 92 was completed in 1812, the year in which Napoleon was beginning to fail in his conquests, and this status was undoubtedly good news to Beethoven. Celebrating this turn of events, the Seventh Symphony premiered at a Viennese concert in 1813 to benefit troops that were wounded in the Battle of Hanau, a small but tactical victory in 1813, which routed Napoleon into a retreat. This concert was possibly the most wildly successful of Beethoven's career. The audience loved it and demanded that the second movement be repeated. Beethoven, who was conducting, was energized, and Ludwig Spohr, a student of his, reported in his autobiography that as a sforzando occurred, he tore his arms with great vehemence asunder. At the entrance of a forte, he jumped into the air. The Seventh Symphony is a gem. I fell in love with it when I was in high school and heard it for the first time, and that relationship has never dimmed. It's a gem. an atmosphere of expectation with this long, slow introduction and multiple themes in the main body, inspired by short dotted rhythms. The second movement, the most famous and the one that has been encored more than you can say, has a theme with multiple variations, basically new material added as it goes. The theme is really a basic chord progression in constant repeated rhythm. It's brilliant and heart-stoppingly beautiful. There's a new tune in the middle, and then the end is as it was at the beginning. The third movement is an optimistic, energetic scherzo, and the finale trumps everything so far with great intendency and jubilant ferocity, thumping and hammering and relentlessly propelled forward. Rhythm is fundamental. Wagner famously said that this is the apotheosis of the dance, the happiest realization of the movements of the body in an ideal form. That's been debated and argued, yet the rhythm is fundamental to its breathtaking ending. Rhythmic inspiration and drive. Spot on. It's really intriguing to understand that this gorgeous, jubilant, wonderful symphony was written in one of the most painful times of Beethoven's life. His deafness was growing worse daily. His deep love affair with Teresa Brunvik had collapsed. He had no success in romance during his life. It was said that he proposed to 16 women who all turned him down. He needed money, but in spite of all of this, he drove into one of the most creative periods of his lifetime. And with Opus 92, he penned one of the most dramatic, thrilling symphonies in his repertoire. We cannot wait to welcome you to the concert hall for our Anchorage Symphony Orchestra, embracing you, our audience, to join the musicians in celebrating these three amazing masterworks.